Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we are setting sail for a decade that smelled like hairspray, tasted like jello molds, and ran entirely on the quiet, iron-willed labour of women who were told to look perfect while doing absolutely everything. We're talking about the 1950s Housewife. Not the cheerful magazine cover version with the gleaming apron and the suspiciously symmetrical casserole. I mean the real one. The one who was up before sunrise, rationing her cold cream, setting her hair on rollers the size of soup cans, and smiling through it all because the neighbours might be watching. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I am deeply grateful for every single one of you. A lot of you have been requesting this topic, and I want to say thank you for that. Knowing what you want to hear about makes this whole thing feel less like a channel and more like a conversation. But before you drift off, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to be a 1950s housewife? Not the fantasy version, the real version. Did she actually enjoy setting her hair in pin curls every single night? Or was she just too tired to fight it? What exactly went into those beauty routines that supposedly took only minutes, but seemed to require 17 products and a minor engineering degree? Did she wake up looking like that? Or was there an entire production happening before her husband shuffled downstairs for his eggs? Could you survive a full day of girdles, gloves, and carefully applied victory rolls without staging a quiet personal revolt by lunchtime? Would you know which shade of lipstick was considered appropriate for a Tuesday morning grocery run versus a Friday evening dinner party? And what happened to the women who simply didn't want to do any of it? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1952. Your hair is in rollers. There is a cold cream situation happening on your face that requires explanation. Your girdle is already staring at you from the chair across the room, and breakfast isn't going to make itself. Good luck. Let's talk about skincare. And by skincare, I mean the 1950s version, which looked less like a relaxing self-care routine and more like preparing a vintage automobile for a show. You didn't just wash your face, you committed to your face. Every single morning and every single night the cold cream came out. Cold cream, for those unfamiliar, is a dense, white, faintly floral-smelling substance that sits somewhere between a moisturizer and a spackling compound. The brand of choice for most women was Pond's, which advertised itself as the secret behind every dewy complexion, every successful marriage, and possibly world peace. You'd scoop a generous amount out of the jar, smooth it across your face in slow upward circles, let it sit there doing whatever cold cream allegedly did, and then remove it with a soft cloth. Then you'd do it again, because one pass was never enough. The instructions on the jar said to use gentle upward strokes, always upward, because downward strokes, according to the beauty experts of the era, encouraged sagging, and sagging was something you were fighting from approximately the age of 22. This was not a casual suggestion. This was doctrine. Women who skipped the upward stroke direction were considered to be sabotaging themselves quietly, like someone who waters their plants with coffee and then wonders why things are going wrong. After the cold cream came the toner, and the toner was bracing. It was usually a clear or pale liquid applied with a cotton ball, wiped across the face in the same upward direction, and it had a sharpness to it that woke you up faster than anything else on the vanity. Most toners of the era contained witch hazel or alcohol or both, which meant they smelled medicinal and felt like a mild slap. which was apparently what the skin needed in order to understand that the day had officially begun. The theory was that the cold cream had opened the pores and the toner was now closing them, a kind of push-pull relationship with your own face that you maintained twice daily for the rest of your life. Then came the moisturizer, which was a lighter cream applied in, you guessed it, upward strokes. By this point you'd been working on your face for roughly 10 minutes and hadn't even started on the actual makeup yet. If this sounds excessive, you need to understand that the skin was considered an ongoing project in the 1950s, something that required consistent attention and the right products, or it would begin to quietly decline in ways that the magazines were very specific and somewhat terrifying about. Photographs of women with fine lines appeared in advertisements with the word before written underneath them in a font that suggested mild catastrophe. The cold cream itself came in a heavy glass jar with a white metal lid, and the sound of that lid being unscrewed was so embedded in the early morning that it became its own kind of alarm clock. You did it in the same order every day: cream on, cream off, tone, moisturize, and then begin the rest. Modern skincare routines can involve 12 steps and 3 serums and something called an essence, which sounds like a potion, and women now spend significant money and considerable time on their skin. So in that sense, nothing has changed except the packaging and the vocabulary and the number of steps, which has somehow doubled. The difference is that today you might do your skincare routine and feel like you're doing something nice for yourself. In 1952, you did it because the alternative was unthinkable. You did it because Pond said so, and your mother said so, and every magazine on every coffee table in America agreed, and 3 sources that unanimous were not to be argued with. You did it in the quiet of early morning before anyone else was awake, working in the lamplight of the vanity mirror, and the cold cream went on in slow upward circles, and the day had not technically started yet. But you had. It's time for bedtime hair, and I mean that literally, because in the 1950s, what you did to your hair before you went to sleep was treated with the kind of seriousness most people reserve for filing taxes. The pin curl was the foundation of everything. Every smooth, bouncy, perfectly shaped wave you see in photographs of the era had its secret origins in a woman sitting at her vanity mirror the night before, methodically sectioning her damp hair into small circles and fastening each one flat against her head with 2 crossed bobby pins. This was not optional. This was not casual. This was the price of beauty, and it was paid in full every single evening. The process began with slightly damp hair because dry hair would not hold a curl with any conviction, and completely wet hair took forever to dry and left you sleeping with a cold, soggy head, which was unpleasant in a way that compounded into resentment by about 2 in the morning. The correct moisture level was somewhere in the middle, damp enough to be pliable, dry enough to set properly overnight, and achieving that precise level required either planning your wash timing carefully or having slightly psychic instincts about how fast your particular hair dried. You sectioned the hair first, parting it into rows that would determine where the curls sat and in which direction they moved. Each section was wound around your finger in a flat circle, kept tight against the scalp, and pinned with 2 bobby pins crossed over each other in an X formation that held the circle flat. A full head of pin curls could require anywhere from 30 to 60 pins, depending on the thickness and length of your hair, which meant that at the end of the process you had a head that looked like something a very organized person had done to a doll, and you were going to sleep like that, pressed against a pillow, for the next 7 hours. The satin pillowcase, if you owned one, was essential. Cotton pillowcases created friction that disturbed the pin curls and also, the beauty experts warned, creased the face in ways that took the morning to smooth out. Satin allowed the head to move during sleep without catching, which meant your carefully constructed curls had a better chance of surviving the night intact. Women who could not afford a full satin pillowcase sometimes used a silk scarf wrapped around the head before bed, which served a similar function and had the bonus of making you look like a photograph of a 1920s film star getting ready for something glamorous, rather than simply protecting your Tuesday hair. The bobby pins worked loose. This was guaranteed. Somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning, at least 3 of them would shift position and press their metal ends directly into your scalp with a precision that suggested they had chosen a specific spot deliberately. You would reach up in the dark, relocate the pin, and go back to sleep. And by morning the whole configuration would have held or it wouldn't have, and you wouldn't know which until the comb out, which was a moment of either quiet satisfaction or creative problem-solving depending on what the night had decided to do. Children who grew up watching their mothers do pin curls learned the ritual the way they learned everything domestic, by watching it done so many times that it became simply how things were. Daughters started doing their own pin curls in their early teens. The bobby pin tin was kept on the vanity and was perpetually both full and never quite full enough, because bobby pins had a tendency to migrate to the floor, the bathroom drain, the gap between the vanity and the wall, and every other location except the tin where they were supposed to live. You bought more. You did the curls. The morning came and the hair was what it was, and then the day began. Let's talk about the girdle, and I want you to approach this topic with the gravity it deserves, because the girdle was not merely a garment, it was a philosophy. It was a statement. It was an architecturally ambitious piece of elastic and reinforced fabric, designed to compress, smooth, and redistribute a woman's body into the precise silhouette that 1950s fashion had decided was the correct one. Getting into a girdle was a physical event. You stepped in, you pulled up, and if your girdle was on the firmer end of the spectrum, what followed was a full-body negotiation, involving hopping, tugging, and a brief moment of genuine uncertainty about whether the garment was going to win. The 1950s silhouette required a small waist, rounded hips, and a smooth, unbroken line from ribcage to thigh. Nature, as it turned out, was not always cooperative in producing this exact shape, and the girdle was the solution. It came in a range of firmnesses, from the lighter roll-on, which was made of stretchy elastic and was considered the casual option, to the full panty girdle with boning and panels, which was more or less a structural garment in the engineering sense of the word. The heavier versions had stays sewn in, which were small rigid strips that ran vertically through the fabric and prevented the whole thing from rolling or bunching. And when you wore one of these, you sat up straight, not because you were thinking about your posture, but because the girdle was not negotiating on the matter. Once it was on, breathing shifted. Not dramatically, not in a Victorian novel collapsing on the sofa way, but noticeably. Deep, thoughtless breaths became slightly deliberate ones. You were aware of your midsection in a way that you were not aware of it in the absence of the garment, which some women found grounding and others found exhausting, and most found simply normal, because they had been wearing girdles since their mid-teens, and had never known a morning without one. Sitting in a girdle required a different technique than sitting without one. You didn't drop into a chair, you lowered yourself thoughtfully, because the compression that kept everything smooth while standing redistributed itself when you bent at the hip, and if you sat down quickly and carelessly, you ended up with a waistband that had travelled somewhere it was not supposed to be and was making its opinion of the situation known. Bending to pick something up off the floor was planned in advance. Getting in and out of a car was accomplished with a slight pivot that kept the hip angle manageable. None of this was considered burdensome. It was simply how you moved when you were dressed correctly, and being dressed correctly was not a special occasion condition. It was Tuesday. The garter attachments were the technical complexity. Most girdles had 4 garter straps hanging from the hem, small adjustable straps with metal clips at the bottom that attached to the stocking welt. These had to be fastened before the stockings went on and after the girdle was in position, and the back ones required either significant flexibility or a mirror or a patient family member, because attaching a garter strap behind your own thigh without being able to see it was a spatial reasoning challenge dressed up as morning routine. Women got very fast at it. It became automatic, fingers finding the clip by feel, the stocking welt by instinct, the whole assembly accomplished in under 2 minutes by anyone with practice, which was everyone. By evening, when the girdle finally came off, the sensation was reportedly remarkable. A kind of full-body exhale that made the removal feel like a small daily luxury. The skin underneath was warm and slightly marked with the impression of the elastic little lines and indentations that faded within an hour. You hung the girdle over the back of the chair or folded it into a drawer, and for the hours between dinner and the morning routine, your body was entirely your own again. Small mercies in the 1950s were real mercies, and this was one of them. Now let's talk about what actually happened to the hair after the pin curls came out, because the pin curl was just the raw material. The real craftsmanship happened in the morning, when you took those carefully formed waves and sculpted them into something that looked effortless, which required approximately 45 minutes of extremely focused effort. The victory roll was perhaps the most iconic style of the era. Twin cylinders of hair rolled back from the face and pinned with a combination of bobby pins, setting lotion, and pure stubbornness. Done correctly, it looked like soft, sophisticated sculpture. Done incorrectly, it looked like something had startled you very suddenly and your hair had reacted. The comb-out was the first step, and the comb-out required patience. You released the pin curls one at a time, letting each circle of hair spring open into a soft coil, and then you did not immediately comb through them, because running a comb through a fresh pin curl without first letting it relax slightly was a reliable way to produce frizz, and frizz was the enemy of every style in the 1950s without exception. You let them breathe. You arranged them loosely with your fingers. Only then did the rat-tail comb come into play, working through the curls from the ends upward, separating them, guiding them, beginning to suggest the direction the style was going to take. The victory roll itself was constructed by taking a section of hair near the front, rolling it back and away from the face in a smooth cylinder, and pinning it against itself with several bobby pins placed in a line that would be hidden inside the roll once the structure held. The roll had to be smooth on the outside, which meant the hair on the surface had to be brushed to a shine and coaxed into lying flat over the cylindrical shape beneath. Setting lotion applied before the comb-out helped with this, giving the hair enough grip to hold the shape without moving. Too much lotion, and the hair looked wet and stiff. Too little, and it wouldn't cooperate. The correct amount was the kind of judgment that came from doing it 400 times until your hands knew without your brain having to weigh in. The rest of the hair, the back and the sides not committed to the rolls, was styled into soft waves or curled under at the ends, depending on the length and the preference and what the occasion required. A simple grocery run might warrant a softer, more relaxed finish. A dinner out required precision. A church service required the same precision, plus enough hairspray to survive the sermon, the social hour afterward, and the drive home with the window cracked. Hairspray in this era was applied from a pump bottle or an early aerosol can, and it was not shy. It held with a seriousness that today's flexible hold formulas have entirely abandoned. A style set with 1950s lacquer did not move in a light breeze. It did not shift in mild humidity. It had committed to being what it was, and it intended to remain that way until you personally intervened with a comb and warm water. Whether this was reassuring or oppressive probably depended on how you felt about the style you were locked into, and how the morning had gone, and whether the victory rolls had cooperated or required a third attempt before you were willing to leave the house with them. Let's talk about lipstick, because in the 1950s, lipstick was not a finishing touch. It was a declaration. A woman in the 1950s did not leave the house without her lips done, and the selection of which lipstick to wear was governed by a set of unspoken rules as complicated and rigorously observed as any legal code. There were daytime shades and evening shades. There were office shades and church shades. There were shades appropriate for a Tuesday, and shades that were frankly excessive for anything short of a formal dinner. The most popular colours ran along a spectrum from soft coral to deep true red, with names like cherries in the snow and Persian melon, which sounds less like a cosmetic and more like a short story. The lipstick itself was housed in a slim metal tube, often gold or silver in finish, with a satisfying click when the bottom twist mechanism brought the bullet of colour up to its full height. Opening your lipstick in a public compact mirror was a gesture so practiced it had become elegant. There was nothing fumbling about it. The motion was smooth, the mirror angled correctly by instinct, the stroke applied without hesitation, because this had been done so many times that the hands no longer needed instructions from the brain. The liner went on first. In the 1950s, the lip line was defined and deliberate, not blended or softened the way later decades would prefer. You drew the outline of your lips with a pencil in a shade close to the lipstick colour, following the natural edge precisely, and then you filled in with the lipstick itself. If your natural lip shape was not cooperating with the fashionable shape of the decade, which favoured a defined Cupid's bow on the upper lip and a full, even lower lip, you could cheat the outline very slightly by drawing just outside your natural line in specific places. This was considered acceptable beauty technique, and not at all the same thing as pretending to be something you weren't, which was a distinction the era maintained with a straight face. The blot was non-negotiable. You applied the colour, pressed your lips together on a folded tissue, and this removed the excess product while setting what remained. Then you applied a second coat, because one coat was a sketch and two coats were a painting, and you were producing a painting. Some women blotted twice, which gave a drier, more matte finish that lasted longer but had less sheen. Some didn't blot at all, which gave a glossier look considered more appropriate for evening than for 11 in the morning at the butcher counter. Eating lunch required a negotiation with the lipstick, because lipstick did not survive a meal with any loyalty whatsoever. By the end of a sandwich, the colour had transferred significantly to the napkin and the glass, and had redistributed itself with no regard for the careful outline you had drawn that morning. This was why the compact and the lipstick travelled in the handbag everywhere, so that after lunch, after coffee, after any meal that required your mouth to participate, you could restore the situation to its correct condition before returning to public visibility. The powder room existed partly for this purpose. You went, you checked, you repaired, you returned. The lips were the first thing people looked at when you spoke, and the last thing they remembered when you left, and you maintained them accordingly. Here's something nobody tells you about 1950s makeup. The foundation selection was, by modern standards, almost impressively limited. You had your choice of pink-based, yellow-based, or what could generously be described as the rest of you are on your own. Foundation in the 50s was thick, opaque, and designed not to enhance your natural skin tone so much as to replace it with a smoother, more socially acceptable version. Pancake foundation, which was exactly what it sounds like, a flat pressed cake of heavily pigmented product applied with a damp sponge, was enormously popular. The goal was coverage, full, total, no survivors coverage. The pancake was a max factor innovation that had originated in the film industry, used on camera to give actors an even matte surface under the brutal intensity of studio lights. By the 1950s, it had migrated into the everyday beauty routines of ordinary women, bringing with it the full coverage aspirations of Hollywood without necessarily bringing along the professional lighting and camera test process that determined which shade was correct for which person. You bought the shade that seemed closest to your skin tone in the fluorescent light of the department store counter, and you went home and discovered that it was either slightly too pink or slightly too beige, and you used it anyway because it was what you had. Application required a damp sponge worked in small circular or stippling motions across the face, building from the center outward and blending carefully at the hairline and jaw, where the foundation had to meet the skin of the neck without producing a visible line. The visible line was the foundational makeup failure of the era, the thing that told everyone watching that you were wearing makeup, which everyone knew you were, but which you were not supposed to make obvious. Ironically, the effort required to make foundation invisible was substantially greater than the effort required to wear no foundation. But this was not the kind of logic that 1950s beauty culture found persuasive. Liquid foundation was also available, slightly sheerer and easier to apply, sold in small glass bottles with narrow necks that dispensed the product one careful drop at a time. You dotted it across the forehead, cheeks, nose and chin, and then blended outward with a sponge or your fingertips in those reliable upward strokes. The coverage was lighter than the pancake, which some women preferred for daytime, reserving the heavier option for evenings and occasions when the lighting was more flattering than the ordinary afternoon. Once the foundation was on, the powder went over it, and this was not optional. Powder set the foundation, prevented shine, and gave the finished face a smooth, matte evenness that was the visual standard of the decade. You pressed it on with a powder puff in gentle dabbing motions, working across the face systematically, and then brushed off the excess with a soft brush so nothing sat too heavily in the fine lines around the eyes and mouth. The finished face had no texture, no shine, no visible pores, and no particular resemblance to the face you had woken up with that morning. It was a surface, it was a presentation, it was the first layer of a performance that would be maintained, touched up, and carefully monitored for the entirety of the day, until the cold cream at bedtime wiped it away and you started fresh in the morning, reaching again for the glass jar, the damp sponge, and the shade that was still slightly too pink, but had become familiar enough to feel like yours. Let's spend a moment on the eyebrows, because the eyebrows in the 1950s were doing a tremendous amount of work, and they deserve recognition. The ideal brow of the era was thin, highly arched, and carefully drawn, giving its wearer the permanent expression of someone who has just heard something mildly surprising, but is too polished to fully react. Achieving this look required first the removal of any hair that fell outside a very specific geometric zone, accomplished with tweezers and a tolerance for mild pain that women of the decade had largely accepted as part of the grooming contract. Once the natural brow had been appropriately thinned or, in some cases, removed almost entirely, the new brow was drawn in with a pencil in short, fine strokes meant to mimic the appearance of actual hair. The tweezing happened by lamplight at the vanity mirror, ideally in the evening when there was more time to be precise, because rushing the tweezing was how you ended up with one brow slightly higher than the other, which created an expression of permanent mild skepticism that no amount of evening out could entirely resolve. You worked from underneath the brow, removing hairs that fell below the desired arch line, and then from above, taking away anything that was too thick or too horizontal for the elevated, refined shape you were constructing. Some women also tweezing between the brows, because a unibrow in the 1950s was not a style statement. It was evidence of a grooming oversight, and evidence of grooming oversights was to be corrected promptly. The pencil used to fill in and define the brow was usually brown or soft black, and the technique was to draw in the direction of hair growth using light, feathery strokes that built density gradually rather than drawing one solid line, which looked drawn on in a way that was too obvious and undermined the entire premise. The arch had to peak at approximately 2/3 of the way along the brow, measured from the inner corner, because a peak that came too early looked surprised, and a peak that came too late looked like you hadn't quite finished. The tail of the brow tapered to a fine point and ended cleanly, and the inner corner started just above the inner corner of the eye. And if all of this sounds like a geometry problem, that is because it was essentially a geometry problem that you solved on your own face every morning with a small pencil. Brow trends in the 1950s shifted slightly across the decade. The very early years favoured an extremely thin, highly arched brow that owed something to the 40s screen sirens. By mid-decade, the brow had softened fractionally, becoming slightly fuller and more naturally shaped, though still dramatically thinner than what nature generally provided. By the late 50s, as the 60s were beginning to send their advance signals, the brow started to thicken again, and women who had been diligently removing every follicle for a decade found themselves attempting to coax back hairs that had, in some cases, given up entirely on returning. The drawn brow required daily attention. Brow pencils wore down quickly and needed regular sharpening, and the shade had to be matched carefully to the hair colour, with brunettes using darker pencils and blondes using softer, lighter ones, because a blonde woman with dark brows read as either very dramatic or very confused, and neither was the intended effect. You sharpened the pencil, you drew the brow, you checked the symmetry in the three-way mirror, you adjusted fractionally, and you moved on. The brows were a small thing in the context of everything else the morning required, but they framed the entire face, and getting them slightly wrong affected everything above the foundation line. They were, in that sense, load-bearing. Now let's talk about washing the hair, which in the 1950s was not something you did every day and not something you did casually. Washing your hair was an event, planned in advance, ideally scheduled for a day when you had time to deal with the aftermath, because the aftermath was significant. Most women washed their hair once a week, and between wash days they managed with dry shampoo, which in the 50s was actual powder. You combed through your hair and hoped for the best, or with careful restyling that worked around the areas of concern. When wash day did arrive, you mixed your shampoo, which was often sold in a single-use sachet, with warm water, worked it through, rinsed, and then began the actual production. The shampoo itself was different from what exists now. Most 1950s shampoos were bar-style or came as a liquid that needed to be diluted, and they lathered enthusiastically, but stripped the hair with a thoroughness that modern formulas specifically try to avoid. The result was hair that was extremely clean in the way that a wooden floor is extremely clean, after someone has gone at it with industrial cleaner. Very effective, slightly harsh, and in need of something restorative applied fairly quickly. Cream rinses existed for this purpose, applied after rinsing out the shampoo, and left on briefly before being rinsed away, and they softened the hair enough to make the styling process manageable. After washing, the hair was towel dried gently, because vigorous towel drying caused frizz, and frizz, as previously established, was the enemy of everything. Then setting lotion was applied, worked through from roots to ends, and the rollers went in. Roller size was not arbitrary. Large rollers produced loose, soft waves. Smaller rollers produced tighter curls. The placement of the rollers determined which direction the hair moved when styled. Getting the roller placement right was a skill that took practice, and once learned became automatic. Your hands sectioning and rolling while your attention was elsewhere. The radio playing something pleasant. The afternoon organising itself around the waiting. The hooded dryer was the appliance that determined how the next hour went. Sitting under the dome of warm air while your rollers set was a social ritual in its own right, because under the dryer you could not hear very well, and you could not do very much, which meant you sat and read a magazine or stared pleasantly at nothing, and the afternoon paused for you in a way that afternoons in the 1950s did not often pause. It was warm. It was loud enough to be peacefully isolating. Some women found it genuinely restful, a pocket of required stillness in a day that otherwise never stopped moving. When the dryer clicked off or the timer on the kitchen stove rang, you checked the rollers by pressing gently against them. Dry hair felt firm and springy. Damp hair felt soft and gave under pressure, and damp hair taken off the roller too early would drop the curl within the hour, which meant you had used an entire afternoon for nothing. Patience was the ingredient that made the difference between a set that lasted a week and one that lasted until lunch. Once the hair was fully dry, the rollers came out in reverse order of how they went in, and the comb-out began, and the week's hair was determined by what happened in the next 20 minutes, for better or worse. Perfume in the 1950s was not something you put on because you felt like it. It was something you applied with purpose, in specific places, in appropriate quantities, for the correct occasions. The rules were unwritten but universally understood. You applied perfume to your pulse points, wrists, behind the ears, the bend of the elbow, the back of the knee if you were being particularly thorough. The popular fragrances of the era ran heavily floral or powdery, or both simultaneously, with names like Evening in Paris and Arpège and Chanel No. 5, which cost enough that most women bought it as a treat rather than a staple, and kept the bottle on the vanity where it could be admired as much as used. The pulse points were chosen for a reason that was both scientific and slightly romantic. The warmth of the blood moving close to the skin surface gently activated the fragrance and helped it project, sending it into the air around you in a way that flat, cool skin could not. You were essentially using your own circulatory system as a delivery mechanism, which sounds more medical than glamorous, but which worked well enough that perfume application has not fundamentally changed on this point in the decades since. The skin behind the ear was particularly valued because it was close to the face, the first place a person moved toward when they came near you, and a fragrance encountered there was intimate in a way that a cloud of perfume from across a room was not. Evening in Paris, sold in a cobalt blue bottle that was almost impossibly pretty, was affordable enough to be widely owned and popular enough to be essentially universal. If you have ever encountered a woman of a certain age who lights up at the mention of it, that is because the blue bottle sat on vanities across the country for a decade and became encoded in the sensory memory of a generation. Chanel No. 5 was the aspirational choice. The bottle kept in a position of visible honour on the vanity, even when nearly empty, because the empty bottle looked as beautiful as the full one, and there was no shame in keeping it around after the perfume was gone. You did not spray generously. Perfume in this era would apply by dab, using the glass stopper of the bottle tipped against the wrist, or the fingertip pressed briefly against the opening. A spray bottle, when it existed, was used with restraint, 1 or 2 sprays at a distance. Over-applying was a social error of a specific and memorable kind, the kind that other women noticed and quietly discussed, and the woman who arrived trailing a 10-foot radius of fragrance before her was understood to have missed the calibration that the situation required. The choice of fragrance was also a statement, quieter than clothing or lipstick but no less deliberate. A powdery, musky fragrance read as sophisticated and mature. A light floral read as young and soft. A heavier oriental fragrance was considered more exotic and was appropriate for evening rather than a Tuesday morning trip to the grocery store, where it could be considered an overstatement of intent. You matched your fragrance to your occasion the way you matched your shoes to your bag, which is to say with complete seriousness, because these things communicated something, and what they communicated was always intentional, and intention in the 1950s was always on display. Let's talk about the powder room, which in the 1950s was not a bathroom. It was a tactical operation centre. Any time a woman left a social gathering to visit the powder room, she was not simply answering a biological call. She was conducting maintenance on the entire presentation. Lipstick was reapplied, powder was pressed, hair was checked and adjusted. If anything was not quite right, the powder room was where it was made right, quietly, efficiently, and returned to the party looking exactly as she had arrived, which was the point. Carrying a small compact and a lipstick in your handbag was not optional, it was operational necessity. The powder room itself, in a well-appointed home or restaurant, was designed for exactly this function. A mirror ran the full length of the wall above the basin. The lighting, ideally, was flattering rather than forensic, though not every powder room had mastered this distinction, and the ones that lit from directly above rather than from the sides produced a shadow situation beneath the eyes that required extra powder to address, and sent you back to your table looking slightly more dramatic than you had left. There was often a small upholstered bench or chair, which was where you sat to do the actual work. Handbag open on your lap, compact mirror held at the correct angle, going through the procedure with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times and intends to be back at the table before the main course was cleared. The handbag check happened before you left the table. You were not going to the powder room unprepared. You made sure the lipstick was in there, that the compact had powder remaining, that the small comb was in its fabric sleeve. Women who arrived at the powder room to discover they had left their lipstick in their other bag had to improvise, borrowing from a friend or simply pressing their lips together as hard as possible and hoping the residual colour was adequate. It usually wasn't, but the motion was made anyway, because the gesture of maintenance mattered even when the tools were unavailable. Going to the powder room together was also its own social ritual. 2 women excusing themselves at the same time was a non-verbal signal that had no verbal equivalent in polite company, which was part of its function. Whatever needed to be said that could not be said at the table could be said at the mirror. Spoken quietly while both parties appeared to be attending to their faces, the conversation held in the gaps between touch-ups and reapplication. This was where assessments were made, opinions were exchanged, and sometimes decisions were reached, all while technically doing something as mundane as checking one's nose powder. Returning to the table correctly was the final step. You came back looking exactly as you had arrived, or perhaps fractionally better, which was the ideal outcome. The lipstick was restored, the powder was fresh, the hair was smooth. You sat down and picked up your conversation as though you had simply stepped away for a moment and nothing particular had happened, because nothing particular had, in the sense that anyone at the table needed to know about. The powder room existed in a kind of official invisibility, a space between scenes where the performance was maintained and the audience was not invited, and its function was so universally understood that the phrase "going to powder my nose" required no further explanation from anyone in 1952. If the girdle was the main event, stockings were its extremely demanding opening act. In the 1950s, bare legs in public were not what a respectable woman did, which meant that every day, before anything else could happen, stockings had to happen. Full-fashion nylons with a seam running up the back were the gold standard, and wearing them correctly required that the seam run perfectly straight, which meant standing in front of a mirror, twisting to check the back of your legs, adjusting slightly, twisting again, and hoping nothing shifted between the bedroom and the front door. Runs were the enemy. A single snag could destroy a stocking instantly, which is why most women owned multiple pairs in careful rotation and treated each one with the reverence of something fragile and expensive, because they were both. Nylon stockings had been introduced just before the Second World War and had caused a sensation so immediate and complete that when production was diverted to parachute material during the war years, women drew seam lines up the backs of their bare legs with the eyebrow pencil to maintain the appearance of wearing them. Read that again. They drew fake seams on their bare legs with a pencil rather than appear in public without stockings. This is the level of commitment the situation required, and it tells you everything you need to know about how non-negotiable the standard was considered. By the 1950s, nylons were widely available again, and the pencil, seam had retired, but the attention required to wear them correctly had not diminished at all. You put them on by gathering the stocking from toe to welt, sliding your foot in carefully, and rolling the fabric up the leg in smooth increments, never pulling sharply, because pulling sharply was how you started a run before the stocking was even fully on, which was a specific kind of morning frustration that made you briefly question your entire relationship with the concept of presentation. The seam required a mirror and a practiced eye. It had to run straight from the heel, straight up the back of the calf, straight up the back of the thigh, a perfectly vertical line that indicated you were a woman who had her life in order. A seam that wandered to the left or curved toward the inside of the leg suggested either carelessness or poor spatial reasoning, and either interpretation reflected poorly. You checked before you left the house. You checked again if you caught your reflection in a shop window. You checked at the powder room if you had any reason to suspect the seam had moved, which it had a tendency to do over the course of a day if the garter tension wasn't quite right. Caring for stockings was its own ongoing project. They were hand-washed in cool water with a gentle soap, never wrung, never hung in the sun, never put anywhere near a rough surface while damp. They were rolled carefully and stored flat or draped over a towel to dry. You kept track of which pairs had the beginning of a snag, which was a small loop of thread pulling slightly loose from the surrounding fabric, and you addressed this immediately with a drop of clear nail varnish, which sealed the snag in place and prevented it from travelling the full length of the stocking in one catastrophic pull. Prevention was cheaper and considerably less upsetting than replacement. You bought extra pairs when they were on sale. You borrowed a pair from your sister in emergencies. You occasionally wore a pair with a very small, very high run, and positioned yourself carefully so the run remained covered by your hem, which required an awareness of your own hemline at all times, and a commitment to not bending in the wrong direction. All of this The care, the checking, the strategic run management, the seam surveillance was performed as part of the ordinary morning, without commentary, without complaint, because this was simply what getting dressed required, and getting dressed correctly was not an achievement in the 1950s. It was the baseline. There was a transitional garment in the 1950s that occupied the space between sleep and presentability, and that garment was the housecoat. The housecoat was worn after you woke up but before you had done anything to yourself, which meant you could make breakfast, supervise children, and manage the first hour of the morning while remaining technically decent without committing to the full performance of the day. It was usually cotton or seersucker in a floral print or a cheerful stripe, and it snapped up the front or tied at the waist. You were not supposed to answer the door in your housecoat. If the milkman came and you were not yet dressed, you either waited for him to leave or opened the door at a crack, and hoped the housecoat read as more intentional than it was. The housecoat had a specific moral status in 1950s domestic culture. It was acceptable within the home during the early morning hours, tolerated at the back door for a brief exchange with the milk or grocery delivery, and completely inappropriate beyond the property line under any circumstances. A neighbour who came to the door unexpectedly before 10 in the morning and found you in your housecoat was not being judgmental if she noticed, because noticing was automatic and involuntary, and both of you knew it. The unspoken understanding was that you would be fully dressed by mid-morning, and the housecoat was simply the scaffolding around which the day's presentation was being constructed. Quality housecoats were not without their own standards. The better ones were made from crisp cotton with a proper collar and a belt that tied, rather than the kind that went missing after the third wash, and left you holding together a garment that hadn't quite committed to staying closed. Department stores sold them near the nightgowns, in displays that always seemed to include a photograph of a smiling woman holding a coffee cup, suggesting that the housecoat was associated with a kind of cheerful, capable morning ease. What the photograph did not show was the cold cream on her face, the pin curls still in her hair, and the particular expression of a person who's been awake for 40 minutes and has 17 things to do before anyone arrives. The children saw their mothers in housecoats and understood intuitively that this was the private version, the version before the day began. There was something about the housecoat that communicated backstage in a way that children absorbed without being taught. You didn't ask your mother difficult questions when she was in her housecoat. You waited until she was dressed, which was when she was fully operational in a way that the housecoat version of her was not quite yet. By mid-morning the housecoat came off, hung on the hook inside the bedroom door, and the dressed version of the day began. The transition was not ceremonial, just practical. You changed, you checked the mirror, you were now the version of yourself that was prepared for whatever the day brought to the front door. The housecoat stayed behind like a shed skin, evidence that a person had been there in the early morning, working quietly and invisibly on the production that everyone else would see. Nobody talked about the housecoat. It was simply part of the architecture of a 1950s morning, the first costume in a day that required several. Every 1950s bedroom had, or aspired to have, a vanity table, which was a small desk with a mirror and a bench, positioned specifically so that a woman could sit and work on herself in dedicated, concentrated silence. The vanity was not decorative. It was functional, and it was loaded. Cold cream, foundation, powder compact, lipstick in a minimum of 3 shades in rotation, eyebrow pencil, mascara wand, setting lotion, perfume bottles arranged by size, a pin tray full of bobby pins, a comb, a brush, a rat-tail comb for sectioning, and somewhere underneath all of that, a hairnet and 2 extra sponge rollers that had rolled back there and were not being retrieved. The organisation of the vanity said something about the woman who used it. A chaotic vanity, products tipped on their sides, powder spilled across the surface, cotton balls scattered, was considered a reflection of a chaotic mind, which was the kind of thing women's magazines implied without stating directly so you understood it, without being able to point to where exactly you'd read it. A well-organised vanity had its products arranged by type and frequency of use. The most reached-for items at the front, the specialty items at the back. The powder compact sat closest, because the powder compact was consulted many times throughout the day. Any time the face needed refreshing, any time the light in a room suggested something needed attending to. The mirror was the central feature, and in the better vanities it was 3-panelled, the centre mirror fixed, and the 2 side panels hinged so they could be angled inward to reveal the back of the head or the side profile. Using the 3-way mirror correctly required a specific positioning of the body relative to all 3 panels simultaneously, and women who had been doing it for years moved into the position automatically. The slight turn of the torso, the lift of the chin, the angle of the outer panels adjusted with one hand while the eyes checked the back of the set. It was a practiced geometry, and once learned it became as unremarkable as pouring coffee. The bench that came with the vanity was usually padded and covered in a fabric that matched either the bench cushion on the bedroom chair or the bedspread, depending on how coordinated the bedroom decor was, and 1950s bedroom decor had opinions about coordination that it shared loudly through matching sets and twin dresses and curtains that tied everything together in a way that suggested the room had been assembled by someone with a plan. Sitting at the vanity bench was a posture situation. You sat up straight because the mirror was at eye level, and slouching changed the angle of your reflection in ways that were unflattering and also technically inaccurate. And you were trying to see yourself as others would see you, which required that you present yourself to the mirror the way you would present yourself to the world. Everything on the vanity had its place, and when something was missing or misplaced, the search was immediate and slightly urgent, because you did not begin the makeup process without the full set of tools available. A missing eyebrow pencil at 6:45 in the morning was a small crisis that required resolution before the day could proceed. Children who touched the vanity products were corrected firmly and immediately, not because the products were particularly delicate, but because the vanity was a workspace, and a workspace required respect, and also because a child who'd gotten into the lipstick left evidence that took 20 minutes and a very specific kind of patience to address. Mascara in the 1950s was not the smooth, quick, swipe-and-go product of later decades. It was a dense, dry cake kept in a small flat pan, and you applied it by first wetting a small brush, rubbing the brush against the cake until it picked up enough pigment, and then carefully coating each individual lash in a process that required a steady hand, good lighting, and the quiet internal acceptance that this was going to take a while. The lashes of the era were full and defined, but not dramatically volumized in the way that became fashionable later. The look was clean and deliberate. You separated the lashes with a small metal comb after application to prevent clumping, and if you blinked at the wrong moment during application, you had an unexpected dot of mascara on your eyelid, which meant starting that particular section over. The cake mascara was usually black or dark brown, kept in a flat rectangular tin roughly the size of a large postage stamp, and it sat in the makeup bag or vanity drawer alongside the brush, which was a small stiff-bristled tool that had to be washed regularly, or it accumulated product until it applied mascara in approximately the way a paintbrush applies house paint, which was not the intended effect. You wetted the brush with a small amount of water, tapped the excess off, and rubbed it firmly across the cake in short strokes until the bristles were loaded with a smooth, even coating of pigment. The application itself required the face to be still and the hand to be steady. You looked down at a hand mirror held below eye level, which caused the lashes to fan downward slightly and made them accessible, and you applied from root to tip in an upward sweep, coating the top surface of each lash. Then you allowed a brief moment of drying time, which prevented fresh mascara from transferring to the skin above the eye when you blinked, and then you applied a second coat if the lashes required more definition. Black mascara was used for evening and by brunettes. Brown was considered more natural and was favoured by blondes for daytime, because the combination of blonde hair and black mascara in the 1950s was considered slightly theatrical for a Tuesday morning. The metal lash comb came out immediately after application, while the mascara was still slightly tacky, and was drawn through the lashes from root to tip in careful passes that separated any clumped lashes before the product dried and made the clumping permanent. Getting the comb through a fresh coat of cake mascara required a light touch, because pressing too hard transferred mascara from the lash comb to the surrounding skin and created small dark smudges that then had to be addressed with a cotton swab dipped in cold cream, which meant removing a portion of the foundation and powder you'd already applied and reapplying it over the corrected area. This was not a drama. It was just a thing that happened sometimes, and you corrected it without ceremony and moved on. Getting mascara in the eye was its own brief catastrophe. The stinging was immediate, the eye watered, and the carefully applied mascara on that side tracked downward, in a way that required complete removal and reapplication once the eye had settled. The correct response was to wait, to let the eye water itself out, to press a clean cloth very gently against it without rubbing, and then to begin again, which took time that the morning did not always have in surplus. Women who wore mascara every day developed a relationship with the possibility of mascara in that, like the way sailors develop a relationship with the possibility of rain. You knew it might happen, you hoped it wouldn't, and you had a plan for when it did. Once a week, or once every 2 weeks if you were managing carefully, you went to the beauty salon, and the beauty salon was not merely a place where hair happened. It was a social institution, a community space, and the one location where a woman could sit relatively still for 90 minutes while someone else did something to her. The salon smelled powerfully of permanent wave solution, which had a chemical sharpness that announced itself from half a block away, mixed with the subtler notes of setting lotion and the faint warmth of dryers running continuously. You sat in the chair, and your stylist worked, and while she worked, you talked, or the woman next to you talked, or someone across the room offered an opinion that nobody had technically asked for but everyone quietly appreciated. You had a standing appointment, because standing appointments were how things were organized in the 1950s, and spontaneity was a concept that applied to other people's lives. Every Thursday at 10, every Friday at 2, whatever your slot was, you kept it with the same reliability that you kept church on Sunday and dinner on the table at 6. The salon receptionist knew your name, knew your stylist, knew whether you took your coffee light and whether you preferred to read or talk while under the dryer, and this accumulation of small personal knowledge was part of what made the salon feel like a community rather than a service. The shampoo came first. Your head tipped back over the basin while the stylist worked the lather through with firm, practiced fingers. The water was warm and the massage was thorough, and there was something in that 20 minutes of someone else handling your hair with complete competence that was genuinely restorative in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not experienced it. You did not wash your hair at home and come to the salon with it already clean. You arrived, and the salon handled everything from the beginning, and this was part of what you were paying for. The rollers went in after the shampoo, positioned according to the style you'd asked for, or, more commonly, the style you always had because you and your stylist had arrived at an understanding of what worked, and both parties had agreed to maintain it indefinitely. Large rollers across the top for volume, medium rollers at the sides for the wave, smaller rollers at the nape if you were wearing the hair up or needed that section particularly curled. You watched in the mirror as she worked, and sometimes you offered guidance, and sometimes you simply trusted the process, because this was a person who had been doing your hair for 3 years and had produced no disasters of note. Under the dryer, the conversation continued over the noise, slightly louder than normal, the kind of talking that happens when you cannot quite hear each other perfectly, and both parties are making a generous effort. You learned about your neighbour's daughter's wedding, the price of something at the butcher, the verdict on the new minister at the Methodist church 3 blocks over. The beauty salon was where information circulated, where the week's events were processed collectively, where the community took stock of itself in the comfortable warmth of running dryers and the particular social ease that came from all being engaged in the same ritual simultaneously. You left with your hair set and your social obligations attended to, and both felt equally necessary. Let's talk about hats, because in the 1950s, a hat was not something you put on when your hair was having a bad day. A hat was a finishing statement, a punctuation mark on the entire outfit, and wearing the correct hat for the correct occasion was part of the same system of rules that governed everything else. Church required a hat. Formal lunches required a hat. Shopping downtown, depending on the level of downtown, could require a hat. And the hats themselves range from the small pillbox style that sat precisely on top of the head and stayed there through the application of a hat pin through the hat, through the hair, and into the skull if necessary, to wider brimmed styles for garden parties and summer occasions, to small cocktail hats for evening events that seemed to exist purely as a gesture toward the concept of headwear without providing any actual coverage. The pillbox hat was perhaps the most emblematic style of the decade's first half, a small flat-topped cylinder of felt or fabric that perched at the crown of the head with a self-possession that suggested it had always been there and intended to remain. It was secured with a hat pin, a long decorative spike pushed through the hat at an angle and through the hair beneath, a manoeuvre that required either confidence or a complete absence of imagination about what could go wrong, and women performed it daily without incident or excessive anxiety. The hat pin also served theoretically as a self-defense implement in emergency situations, a dual purpose that women of the era seemed to regard with equanimity. Matching the hat to the outfit was not a suggestion. The hat had to coordinate with the coat, and the coat had to coordinate with the dress, and the gloves had to work with both, and the bag had to complete the argument that all the other elements had been building toward. A woman who got this right was composed. A woman who didn't had made a mistake that the neighbourhood would not specifically mention, but would also not forget. Hats were bought with outfits in mind, or outfits were bought with hats already in the wardrobe considered. The coordination was planned in advance because arriving at a situation with a hat that didn't quite work was not something you corrected on the way there. Storing hats required hat boxes, which were round cardboard containers that stacked in the closet and tumbled down at inopportune moments. A woman with a good hat collection had a good hat box situation, which meant several boxes of varying sizes arranged with some system of organization that made the correct hat retrievable without dismantling the entire stack. The hat came out of the box, was placed on the head, was secured, and was checked in the full-length mirror before departure. Placement mattered. The same hat worn at slightly different angles communicated slightly different things, and the woman who understood this adjusted accordingly, tilting the brim or repositioning the crown until the message was correct, and she could leave the house with confidence that every element was working together as intended. This brings us to gloves, which in the 1950s were worn outside the home on a regular basis, and were considered part of dressing correctly in a way that is nearly incomprehensible from a modern vantage point. Short cotton gloves for daytime shopping, longer kid leather gloves for evening, white gloves for church and formal occasions. The gloves were not merely decorative, they covered your hands, which meant that going out in public with uncovered hands was, in certain contexts, a small social statement. You put on gloves before you left the house. You removed them when you sat down to eat, tucking them neatly into your handbag or draping them over your lap. You put them back on when you stood up. The ritual was so ingrained that women did it automatically, without thought, the way you might now lock your phone before putting it down. Cotton gloves for daytime came in white, ivory and pale colours that corresponded with the season and the outfit, and they were short, ending at the wrist or just above it, and they buttoned with a single small button at the inside of the wrist that required a specific twisting motion to close and a slightly undignified pinching action to open. This button was where run started, if cotton gloves could be said to run, or where the stitching began to give way after enough seasons of daily use, and a glove whose button had come loose, or whose wrist seam was beginning to separate, was a glove that needed replacement rather than repair, because repaired gloves were visible as repaired, and visible repair was its own small statement. Kid leather gloves for evening were an entirely different category of object. They were soft and supple and fit closely to each finger individually, and putting them on required the same gentle rolling technique as stockings, working each finger in carefully from the tip, smoothing out any wrinkles in the leather, ensuring the seams lay flat. Good leather gloves were expensive enough to be kept for years and maintained carefully, stored flat or on glove forms in a drawer lined with tissue. They were cleaned with a specific leather conditioner and never submerged in water. They were an investment that announced itself quietly, and a woman in good leather gloves at an evening event was communicating something about her standards that required no elaboration. White gloves for church were the most demanding in terms of maintenance, because white gloves showed everything and were expected to show nothing. A grey smudge at the fingertips or a faint brown mark at the palm indicated that the gloves had not been laundered since last Sunday, which was one Sunday too many. They were washed after every wearing, dried flat, pressed while slightly damp with a cool iron to restore their crispness, and folded back into their box for the following week. The effort required to keep white gloves white while wearing them through a Sunday of handshaking, hymnal holding, and coffee hour socializing was the kind of quiet, ongoing labour that made the 1950s what it was, a decade in which maintaining the appearance of effortlessness required an effort that was never acknowledged as such. Here is something that becomes clear very quickly when you start examining a 1950s housewife's day. The beauty routine and the domestic routine were not separate tracks. They ran simultaneously, which meant that the hair you spent 45 minutes setting and drying and pinning was the same hair that was going to supervise a pot roast for 3 hours and answer the door when a neighbour came by and get the children ready for school. This created a specific kind of challenge, which was maintaining the hair in a state that would remain presentable through all of the above while also doing all of the above. The solution was, broadly, hairspray. Lots of it. Applied generously at the end of the morning routine, The lacquer created a surface that could withstand a moderate amount of domestic turbulence. Steam was the primary enemy of the set hairstyle, and the kitchen produced steam continuously and without apology. Boiling water for vegetables, simmering a pot of soup, opening the oven to check the progress of something that needed checking, all of these activities sent warm moisture into the air directly in the vicinity of the person doing them, which was you, and your hair was in the direct line of consequence. The front sections near the face were most vulnerable, because those were the sections closest to the steam rising from the stovetop, and those were also the most visible and therefore the sections that mattered most to maintain. Some women tied a light scarf around their hair while cooking, loosely enough not to disturb the set but tightly enough to create a barrier between the steam and the style beneath. Others simply worked quickly, got in and out of the kitchen's most steam-intensive operations, and checked the hair in the small mirror kept near the kitchen window when the stovetop work was done. The comb lived in the kitchen drawer for this reason, alongside the scissors for opening packaging and the pen for the grocery list. It was a practical tool in a practical space, available when needed, used without ceremony, returned to the drawer when the touch-up was complete. Baking produced a different threat, which was the dry heat of the oven combined with the flour that rose into the air when you worked with dough and then settled, very lightly, on every surface, including your hair. A woman who had been baking all morning and had not attended to her hair before answering the door might find herself receiving a neighbour on the front step with a faint dusting of flour across the crown of her head that suggested she had been busier than she looked. This was not a crisis, but it was a detail that got filed away in the neighbour's running assessment of how things were going over at your house, and the running assessment was perpetually active. The goal was to have the hair look as composed at 4 in the afternoon, when your husband came home, as it had at 8 in the morning when the day began. Whether this was achievable depended on how the day had gone, and how much the steam and the activity had cooperated with the hairspray's best intentions. On good days, the set held, and the touch-up was minor. On difficult days, a full recomb was required before 5 o'clock. The rollers came back out for a quick reset on the worst sections, and the afternoon reorganized itself around this priority, because the presentation for the evening was not considered less important than the presentation for the morning. It was the same standard, maintained continuously, from the first pin curl of the previous evening to the cold cream of the night ahead. Let's say it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and your husband is expected home at 6, and guests are expected at 7. This is where you understand what the 1950s housewife was actually capable of, because the transformation from having been managing the house all day to being a composed and welcoming hostess was supposed to happen in that 1-hour window, and it was supposed to be invisible. You changed out of the house dress or the casual daytime clothes. You refresh the hair, which might mean a quick reset with a comb and a fresh application of spray, or it might mean repinning a section that had lost its shape. You touched up the makeup, fresh powder, fresh lipstick, a check of the eyes. You changed into something appropriate for the evening, which was a different category of clothing than the morning had required. The dress you changed into for the evening was not the same dress you had worn during the day, because daytime dresses were cotton and practical, and had probably been near the kitchen, and evening dresses, even for an informal dinner at home, were something slightly more considered. A shirtwaist in a better fabric, or a wool skirt with a blouse rather than the cotton version of the same silhouette. You freshened the perfume, one light dab at the wrist, because the morning's application had faded through the day, and the evening required its own fragrance presence. The earrings came out of the jewellery box because daytime might have been plain ears or small studs, but company meant pearls or something, with a slight formality that signalled this was no longer just a Tuesday. this was an occasion being treated as such. The kitchen had to be in a state that did not suggest chaos, which meant that whatever had been happening in there for the past 3 hours needed to be at a stage where it could manage itself briefly while you attended to yourself. Timing dinner so that the window between 5 and 6 could be used for personal preparation was a domestic calculation that required planning the meal backward from its serving time, working out which elements needed active attention and which could be left to simmer without supervision. Women who were good at this were considered accomplished. Women who were still in their house dress at 6:15 with something boiling over on the stove were considered to have misjudged the afternoon, which was a gentle way of saying something less gentle. Your husband's arrival was the first audience for the evening transformation. He came home to a wife who looked composed, a house that smelled like dinner rather than the accumulated effort of making dinner, and an atmosphere that suggested the day had been managed rather than survived. Whether this was the reality of the day was not the relevant question. The presentation was the reality. The 1950s understood the performance of domestic life as a skill, and the skill was not in the hiding of effort, but in the creation of an environment where the effort had produced its desired result so completely that the effort itself became invisible. By the time guests arrived at 7, everything was in its correct position. You, the house, the food, the table. And if you had managed it all in a 1-hour window that began with the day's work still on you and ended with the evening's presentation assembled and ready, no one who walked through that door would have any reason to suspect that the interval between these two states had been anything other than graceful. That was the point. That had always been the point. And then the day ended, and the cold cream came back out because the evening routine was the mirror image of the morning, and nothing was left to chance. The lipstick came off first, blotted away with the tissue in long, careful strokes. The foundation and powder followed, removed with the cold cream applied in those same slow upward circles, lifted away with a soft cloth, leaving the face clean and slightly shiny, and entirely private in a way it hadn't been since before the morning routine began. Eye makeup was removed with a separate product, specifically formulated, because getting cold cream in your eye was an unpleasant experience, and also unnecessary when the correct tool existed. The eyebrows, which had been penciled in that morning, were cleaned away, and underneath them was whatever the real brow was doing, which was often considerably less dramatic. The removal was methodical and complete. You did not go to sleep with makeup on, because sleeping in makeup was considered both a hygiene failure and a beauty failure, clogging the pores you had been diligently managing all day and undoing the cold cream work that was supposed to take place while you slept. Night cream worked on the face during sleep. This was the accepted wisdom, and it could not do its work if the face was still wearing a layer of foundation and powder and the remains of the day's presentation. So the removal was thorough, and it was followed by the night cream, and the night cream was applied in the same upward direction as everything else, because the direction never changed. There was something quietly satisfying about the removal, even if no one in the 1950s would have used that language to describe it. The day had required the presentation to be maintained for a specific number of hours, and now the maintenance was over, and the face you were going to sleep with was the face that was actually yours, without the foundation smoothing, without the powder's matte finish, without the lipstick's precision. The cold cream came off white and cloudy on the cloth, carrying with it the colours and textures of the day, and what was left behind was skin, ordinary and unglamorous, and entirely sufficient for the bedroom and the dark. The hair came down next, or rather it went up into its nighttime configuration, which for many women meant the pin curls going back in for the following day's style. The decision about whether to repin or to sleep in a hairnet that preserved the existing set depended on how the set was holding, and whether tomorrow required a fresh style, or whether the current one had another day in it. A set that was still relatively crisp could be preserved for a second day with a hairnet and careful sleeping. A set that had given its best that day needed fresh curls and another night's investment to be ready for the morning. The vanity was tidied before bed, products returned to their positions, the cloth used for cold cream removal rinsed and hung to dry, the bobby pin tray restocked from the collection that had accumulated on the dresser through the day. The bedroom returned to its orderly state, the preparation for tomorrow already beginning in the small acts of resetting tonight. By the time the lamp went off, everything was in its place, the face cleaned and creamed, the hair curled and netted, the vanity organized, the day fully concluded. And in the morning, when the lamp came back on and the cold cream jar was unscrewed, the whole production would begin again, exactly as it had, patient and precise and entirely expected, a woman making herself ready for a world that required it, and never once asked if she minded. Let's talk about the beauty counter at the department store, which in the 1950s occupied a specific place in a woman's life, somewhere between the pharmacy and the temple. The counters were positioned at the front of the store, gleaming under bright lights, staffed by women in white lab coats or tailored uniforms who'd been trained to speak with authority about the products they were selling. The language was scientific and aspirational simultaneously, complexion perfecting, age defying, tone correcting, all words that promised a gap between where you currently were and where you could be with the correct product. Trying on lipstick was a ritual. The demonstrator would select a shade, apply it to the back of your hand or, if you were a serious buyer, directly to your lips, and then hold a small mirror while you considered yourself. The counters themselves were architectural achievements of a specific commercial ambition. Glass cases displayed the products at a slight angle, each item positioned so that its packaging caught the light favourably. The gold of the lipstick tubes and the clean white of the powder compacts arranged in rows that suggested abundance without clutter. You did not simply reach in and take what you wanted. You stood at the counter, and the woman behind it retrieved things for you, placing them on the glass surface for your consideration, which gave the whole transaction the weight of a consultation rather than a purchase. You were not buying mascara. You were receiving a recommendation from someone who understood your situation and was offering a solution. The women who staffed these counters were themselves demonstrations of the products they sold, which was part of the point. Their foundation was immaculate. Their lips were precisely defined. Their brows were the correct shape for the decade, and their overall appearance communicated that the products worked and that working in cosmetics was not a lesser occupation but a professional one that required knowledge and skill. They remembered regular customers and their preferred shades, asked after children by name, and noted when a woman looked tired in a tone that was concerned rather than critical, and immediately pivoted to which product would address the concern. It was a specific kind of attentive commerce, personal without being intrusive, helpful without being presumptuous. The decision of which brand to be loyal to was not taken lightly in the 1950s. Revlon, Maybelline, Max Factor, Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, each had its advocates and its detractors, and the choice signalled something about your taste and your budget and your understanding of the cosmetics hierarchy. Revlon was widely popular and relatively accessible, its advertising bold and its colours named with a dramatic flair that made selecting a lipstick feel like a small act of self-definition. Elizabeth Arden was aspirational. its pink packaging and its higher price point, suggesting a level of refinement that not everyone could maintain, but everyone could appreciate from a respectful distance. Samples were sometimes offered, small foil packets of cream or miniature lipstick bullets, in shades the brand was promoting that season, and these went into the handbag and were used with the same diligence that full-size products were used, because a sample was a test and a test was an opportunity, and a woman who found a product she loved at the beauty counter and added it to her routine had made a small but genuine improvement to her daily life that cost nothing except the 30 minutes it took to stand at the counter and be attended to, which many women found, if they were being honest, to be among the more pleasant 30 minutes the week had to offer. In the 1950s, women's magazines were not passive reading material, they were instructional. Every issue of Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's and Woman's Day contained detailed authoritative guidance on how to look, how to keep a house, how to cook, how to manage your husband's moods, and how to present yourself to the world in a way that reflected well on your family. The beauty sections were extensive. Step-by-step diagrams showed you how to apply foundation correctly, how to shape your brows, how to position your rollers for maximum wave. The before and after photographs were a staple, always showing a woman who had committed a minor beauty error and then been corrected, the implication being that the correct state was achievable and the incorrect state was a choice. The magazines arrived by post or were collected from the drugstore on the day of publication, and their arrival had a mild ceremonial quality, particularly for women who lived in suburbs where the social calendar was structured and the weeks between issues could feel long. You read them at the kitchen table after the children were at school, or in the evening while something was in the oven, or in sections across several days if the week was particularly full. The advertisements were as instructive as the articles, sometimes more so, because the advertisement showed you what the ideal looked like in full colour, and with the confidence that the editorial content occasionally softened with caveats. The before and after was the most powerful recurring format in the beauty pages, and it operated on a logic so simple and so effective that it has never really stopped being used. Here is a woman with a problem. Her brows are too heavy, her foundation is the wrong shade, her hair is not doing what hair should do. Here is the same woman after intervention, corrected, refined, improved. The problem in the before photograph was never dramatic. It was always something recognizable and correctable, something the reader might quietly suspect about herself, and the after photograph showed how close the corrected version was to the current version if only the right steps were followed. The gap between before and after was always bridgeable. That was the point. Despair was not the goal. Actionable aspiration was the goal. Articles on beauty in these magazines were written with the authority of expertise and the warmth of a knowledgeable friend, a combination that was very effective and not entirely coincidental. The beauty editor knew things you didn't, and she was sharing them with you specifically, which created a relationship of trust that made the reader more likely to follow the guidance than if the same information had been presented as a list of rules. You were not being told what to do, you were being let in on something, and the distinction made all the difference to how the instruction landed. Between the articles and the advertisements, a clear and consistent picture emerged of what a woman in the 1950s was supposed to look like, and how she was supposed to achieve it, and this picture was refreshed every month with minor variations that kept the standard from feeling static, while ensuring it never became unrecognizable. The magazines did not create the standards of the decade in isolation. They reflected, amplified, and maintained them in a cycle that was self-reinforcing and completely effective, and the women who read them were participants in that cycle in a way that was both chosen and not chosen, which is the nature of cultural standards in any era. You picked up the magazine because you wanted to. What happened after you opened it was somewhat less voluntary. Let's pause on rouge, which is what blush was called in the 1950s, and which was applied with the deliberateness that today's contouring tutorials can only aspire to. Rouge came in compact form, a pressed circle of pink or coral pigment, applied with a round puff in a soft circular motion to the apples of the cheeks. The goal was healthy colour, a rosiness that suggested good circulation and outdoor vitality, which was ironic given that most of the women applying it had spent the last several hours indoors doing laundry. The shade had to coordinate with the lipstick. You couldn't wear a blue-red lip and a peachy rouge simultaneously without it reading as someone who was trying too hard or not trying correctly, which were considered different failures. The application technique mattered as much as the shade, and the technique was circular and light, using the small velvet or chamois puff that came with the compact in sweeping motions across the roundest part of the cheek, which you located by smiling and noting where the flesh rose. The smile was a practical tool, not a beauty tip cliché. It physically changed the topography of your cheek and showed you exactly where the colour needed to land in order to read as natural rather than theatrical. The same amount of rouge applied to a neutral face in the wrong location read as two separate dots of colour rather than a healthy flush, which was a technical failure visible from across a dining room. Some women applied rouge before foundation and powder, which allowed the powder to soften its intensity and blend it more seamlessly into the overall complexion. Others applied it after powder, on top of the set face, using a very light hand so that the puff deposited only a whisper of colour that built gradually with each pass. The after powder method gave more control over the final depth of colour, but required more restraint in the application, because rouge over powder had no forgiveness. Too much in one pass sat on the surface of the powder rather than blending into it, and the only correction was powder over the rouge, which buried it, and then a lighter reapplication, which extended the process significantly. The rouge compact was a smaller thing than the powder compact, more portable, more discreet, and it travelled in the handbag for touch-ups in the same way the powder and lipstick did, though rouge was considered less urgent to refresh than either. Once applied correctly in the morning, the cheek colour tended to hold reasonably well through the day, fading gradually rather than disappearing suddenly, which meant a mid-afternoon touch-up was optional rather than mandatory. Women with naturally high colour sometimes skipped rouge entirely, or applied only the faintest amount, while women with very pale complexions found it essential, the colour doing the work of making the rest of the face's architecture readable from a social distance. And then there was the coordination problem, which was genuinely a problem that required forethought. If you were wearing a rose-toned lipstick, the rouge needed to be rose-toned as well, slightly lighter than the lip but from the same colour family. If you were wearing orange-red lips, the rouge moved toward coral. If you were wearing a deep berry lip, which was considered quite bold for daytime but acceptable for evening, the rouge went softer and pinker, pulled back from the drama of the lip rather than competing with it. Getting this wrong was noticed. Getting it right was not commented on, because getting it right was simply the baseline, and in the 1950s the baseline was never applauded. It was simply expected, and you met it, and tomorrow you met it again. Here is an underappreciated chapter in the story of 1950s beauty. The headscarf. Not as a fashion statement, though it was certainly that too. Grace Kelly tied one under her chin getting into a convertible, and it became immediately iconic, but as a practical tool for preserving a hairstyle in an environment that was actively hostile to it. Wind was the enemy. Humidity was a saboteur. Cooking steam, rain, and the general outdoor world all wanted to undo what the morning had taken 45 minutes to accomplish. The solution was to cover it. A silk or cotton square folded into a triangle and tied under the chin protected the set from the above-listed threats while remaining visually acceptable. The tying technique was its own small art form. The scarf was folded corner to corner into a triangle, the long folded edge placed across the forehead just at the hairline, the two ends brought down beside the face and tied under the chin in a neat knot, with the pointed back of the triangle falling over the crown of the head and covering the bulk of the style beneath. Tied too tightly and the scarf left a mark across the forehead that took time to fade. Tied too loosely and it slipped backward during activity, which defeated the purpose and also looked slightly chaotic. The correct tension was snug without pressure, secure without constriction, and women who wore scarves regularly found the knot by feel without looking, adjusting the tightness before they stepped outside with the same automatic precision as straightening a seam. The fabric of the scarf mattered. Silk moved beautifully and was gentle against both the hair and the face, but it slipped more readily than cotton and required a more careful tie to stay in position. Cotton was sturdier and more forgiving in the wind, but was less elegant and was considered more appropriate for gardening and grocery runs than for occasions with any social formality attached. Printed scarves in florals or geometric patterns were common and cheerful, coordinates that worked with casual daytime clothes without requiring a hat. Solid silk scarves in ivory or pale colours dressed up more easily and could be worn to slightly more formal daytime occasions without looking like you had covered your hair because something had gone wrong with it, which was always the secondary concern, that the covering would be read as concealment rather than maintenance. Outdoors in the wind, the scarf was genuinely functional in a way that today's dry shampoo and flexible hold spray can only partially replicate. A fully lacquered 1950s set could withstand a moderate breeze, but a sustained wind of any real enthusiasm would dismantle the front sections around the face first, lifting and separating the careful waves in a way that could not be corrected without a comb and a mirror. The scarf eliminated this possibility entirely by removing the wind's axis to the hair, which was an engineering solution of beautiful simplicity. You were going to the market. Your hair was not available for meteorological interaction. The scarf communicated this clearly, and the wind, finding nothing to work with, moved on. Coming inside, you untied the scarf, folded it, and put it in your bag or your coat pocket, and if the hair beneath had survived the journey in good condition, which it usually had, you ran the comb through the front sections briefly, and were restored to full presentability within 90 seconds. This was the ideal outcome, and it was achieved with enough regularity that the headscarf became as standard an accessory as the gloves, chosen each morning with the same consideration given to what the day's activities required and what the weather appeared to be planning. And finally, let's talk about what all of this actually cost, not just in money, though the money was considerable for a household budget in the 1950s, but in time, in energy, in the accumulated weight of standards that reset themselves every single morning. A woman who followed the full beauty routine of the era was spending conservatively an hour in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening on her appearance, alone, every day, 7 days a week. That is roughly 10 hours a week, 520 hours a year, devoted to a standard that was described in magazines and advertisements as simply what a woman naturally wanted to do for herself. And many women did find genuine pleasure in it. The ritual, the transformation, the satisfaction of doing something well. The financial cost was real, and was managed with the same careful accounting applied to the household budget in general. Cosmetics were not luxuries in the 1950s, they were necessities, which meant they were purchased regularly and tracked with attention. Lipstick was replaced when it ran down to the last half-inch in the tube. Foundation was restocked before it ran out entirely, because running out of foundation was not a condition you wanted to find yourself in on a Tuesday morning with nowhere to be except visible. Cold cream, powder, mascara, setting lotion, hairspray, bobby pins, and the weekly salon visit all had line items in the domestic budget as reliable as the grocery bill and the utility payment. Some products were saved for and purchased as genuine treats: the good perfume, the quality face cream that cost more than the drugstore alternative, but was considered worth the difference by the women who used it, and swore by it with the loyalty of a personal testimony. These products sat at the back of the vanity and were used with a slight restraint that preserved them, a slightly smaller amount dispensed than generosity would suggest, because the good cream needed to last through the month, and possibly into the next, and stretching it was a small domestic economy practiced without embarrassment. What the money could not account for was the time, and the time was enormous when you looked at it honestly. The morning routine took an hour on a good day and longer on days when the hair required extra attention, or the mascara application had a difficult moment, or the girdle made its objections known, and the whole assembly process ground to a slower pace than ideal. The evening routine took 30 minutes. The weekly shampoo and set took an afternoon. The salon visit took 90 minutes plus travel. Added together across a year, the hours devoted purely to the maintenance of personal appearance constituted a part-time employment in its own right, performed without pay, without recognition, and without the option of calling in sick. The women who did all of this and made it look simple were not simple women. They were skilled and practiced and organized and patient, and they operated within a set of expectations that left almost no room for the day when the hair wasn't cooperating and the cold cream had run out, and the girdle was making a philosophical argument against being worn, and the entire production felt not like self-care but like a second job that started before the first one had even been acknowledged. Those days happened. You still got dressed. The standard did not negotiate. And if the 1950s housewife had thoughts about this arrangement, she had them quietly, at the vanity, in the early morning silence, before the cold cream came off and the performance began. Let's talk about nails, because in the 1950s your fingernails were not a minor detail. They were a visible extension of the same system of presentation that governed everything else, and they were examined by other people with the same quiet, thorough attention that was applied to your hemline, your posture, and your lip colour. The ideal nail of the era was oval-shaped, moderately long, and painted in a shade that coordinated with the lipstick, because your hands and your face were supposed to be in conversation with each other. The most popular shades ran from clear and pale pink for daytime propriety to deep reds and corals for evenings and special occasions, and the names were as theatrical as the lipstick names: Cherries in the Snow, Fatal Apple, Pink Lightning, each one a small dramatic narrative compressed into a quarter-inch of colour. The application process began in the evening, because nail varnish required drying time that the morning could not reliably provide without incident. You started with a base coat, a clear or pale formula applied to the bare nail and allowed to dry completely before the colour went on, because the base coat prevented the pigment from staining the nail plate and gave the colour something smooth to adhere to. Skipping the base coat was a shortcut that revealed itself over time in the form of yellowed nails under the polish and colour that chipped at its edges rather than lifting cleanly, and women who had learned this lesson the hard way did not skip the base coat again. The colour went on in 2 thin coats, with genuine drying time between them, and the technique was a single stroke down the centre of the nail from base to tip, followed by 1 stroke on each side, covering the nail in 3 passes that left a smooth, even film of colour with no dragged streaks or flooded cuticles. A flooded cuticle, where the varnish had crept past the nail's edge and onto the surrounding skin, was corrected immediately with a pointed cotton swab dipped in remover, because dried varnish on the cuticle peeled within a day and took a chip of the adjacent colour with it when it went. The correction took 30 seconds, but required a steady hand and good lighting, and the kind of focused attention that is difficult to sustain at 10 o'clock in the evening, when the children are finally asleep and you have been on your feet since 6 in the morning. The top coat sealed everything, added the shine that made the colour look finished rather than applied, and extended the wear by several days if the formula was good. With the top coat on, you sat with your hands spread flat on the table, fingers slightly apart, for as long as patience and the evening schedule allowed, because pressing the nails together before they were fully dry produced impressions that had to be filed smooth or polished over. Some women held their hands in front of the electric fan to speed the drying. Others simply sat with them extended and talked or listened to the radio and waited. A chipped nail in public required action, which meant keeping a small bottle of the current colour in the bathroom for emergency repairs. The repair itself was done quickly. A thin coat over the chip, feathered slightly at the edges to blend with the surrounding intact polish, dried briefly, and presented back to the world as though nothing had happened. The woman with 10 perfectly maintained nails was a woman who had not been careless, and carelessness, in the 1950s, was always visible, always noted, and always held as evidence of something larger than the chip it actually was. Underneath all the visible beauty work, there was another layer of maintenance that was equally important and considerably less discussed, which was the management of the body itself in terms of scent. Deodorant in the 1950s was not the effortless roll-on or spray of later decades. It was a cream or a paste applied with your fingers, or in some cases a stick formula that was slightly more convenient but still required attention to make sure the application was thorough. The advertising for these products in women's magazines was direct to the point of being alarming by modern standards, frequently suggesting that a woman who neglected this particular area of her routine risked her marriage, her friendships, and her social standing simultaneously. Whether or not you believed the advertising, the message had been delivered clearly enough that the routine was observed. The cream deodorants of the era came in small flat tins or jars, applied with the fingertip to the underarm, and they worked by combining a mild antiseptic with an aluminum compound that reduced perspiration, though the science behind this was rarely explained in consumer materials, the advertising preferring the language of freshness and confidence to anything that sounded mechanical. The application required that your fingers then be washed, because residue on the fingertips transferred to clothing and left marks on fabric that were stubborn and embarrassing to explain. The stick deodorant was considered more convenient precisely because it eliminated the finger application step, though the early stick formulas left a white residue on dark clothing that required inspection before dressing to avoid the specific humiliation of a white streak across a navy sleeve. The talcum powder that followed was different from the deodorant in both function and atmosphere. Where the deodorant was clinical and necessary, the talcum powder was sensory and gentle, the soft puff pressed against a large powder pad, and then tapped across the body in sweeping motions that left the skin dry and faintly fragrant. The powder absorbed moisture, reduced friction in areas where fabric met skin, and contributed a softness to the skin surface that the morning's bath had started and the powder completed. The ritual of dusting with talcum was one of the more quietly pleasant parts of the beauty routine, requiring no precision, no mirror, no careful attention to detail. Just the puff and the powder and the faint floral cloud that settled around you briefly and then became the invisible layer beneath everything else. The fragrance of the talcum was chosen to complement, or at least not conflict with the perfume applied at the pulse points, which meant that women who wore floral perfumes generally used floral talcum and avoided anything that would produce an olfactory argument between the two scents. Baby powder, which was talcum in a plain formula, was kept near the children's changing area, but also used by many women who preferred a neutral, rather than fragrant option for themselves, particularly during summer months when the accumulated scents of the day could feel like too much by afternoon. What the deodorant advertisements never said directly but implied consistently was that the management of body scent was a moral question as much as a hygiene one, a reflection of your respect for the people around you and therefore of your character. This framing was effective and somewhat manipulative and entirely of its time, and it meant that the invisible layer of talcum and deodorant carried with it a weight slightly greater than its physical presence warranted. You applied it because it was practical, yes, but also because not applying it said something about you that you were not prepared to have said, and in the 1950s the gap between what was said about you and what was true was a gap worth defending at almost any cost, including a daily application of cream from a small tin that smelled like antiseptic and ambition. Most mornings in the 1950s began with a quick wash at the sink rather than a full bath, because a full bath took time and hot water, and the morning did not always have either to spare. But the bath itself, the real bath, the unhurried one, was scheduled, and in many households it was scheduled for Saturday night, in preparation for Sunday church, which meant the bath carried a slightly ceremonial weight beyond the merely hygienic. You ran the water warm, not hot, because the beauty advice of the era warned that water that was too hot was hard on the skin, opening the pores in a way that was considered aggressive rather than cleansing. Bath salts were added, sold in large decorative containers that sat on the edge of the tub, in scents that matched or complemented the perfume you intended to wear afterward. The bath salts were one of the small domestic luxuries that existed in the 1950s, in a form that acknowledged pleasure without indulging it excessively. They were practical, in the sense that salt softened hard water and left the skin feeling smooth, and they were pleasurable, in the sense that pouring them into the running water and watching them dissolve produced a satisfaction that was minor but genuine. The containers they came in were often pretty, glass jars with printed labels or ceramic pots with lids, and they sat on the edge of the tub as both a functional supply and a decoration, because the 1950s bathroom was a room that was also expected to be pleasant to look at, and the bath salts contributed to this aspiration. The children were bathed first, which was logistically sensible and also meant that by the time you lowered yourself into the tub, the bathroom had been through the energetic phase of the evening and had emerged slightly damp and considerably quieter. The children's bath was efficient and functional, accomplished with the speed and purpose of someone who has a list of things still to do. Your bath was different. It was the one in the week when the bathroom door closed and the hot water was yours, and the demands of the household were temporarily suspended for 20 minutes of warmth and stillness, which was as close as the 1950s housewife came to what a later era would call self-care, and she did not call it anything except a bath. After the bath came the toweling, performed in the correct direction, downward strokes that went with the grain of the skin rather than against it, because the beauty guidance was specific even about this. Then the talcum powder, then the body cream applied to the elbows and heels, and knees where dryness accumulated. Then the decision about whether to do the pin curls tonight or preserve the current set for one more day with a hairnet. This calculation was made with the week's schedule in mind. What was happening Sunday, what the hair needed to look like, whether the current set had enough life left in it to be worth preserving, or whether fresh curls would produce a better result for the effort invested. The arithmetic of the 1950s beauty routine was constant and unconscious, running in the background of every decision like a small, perpetually active program. The Saturday bath marked the end of the week's ordinary time and the beginning of the week's formal time, the pivot between the days when things got done and the day when things were presented. It was a domestic threshold, quiet and unannounced, accomplished in a warm bathroom with bath salts and a good towel, and when it was over you were clean and soft and prepared for Sunday, in a way that the week's quick sink washes had not quite achieved, and the preparation felt complete in a way that was its own small satisfaction. Here is a dimension of the 1950s beauty and presentation culture that extended well beyond the woman herself. The children also had to look right. A woman whose children appeared in public with dirty faces, uncombed hair, or mismatched socks was communicating something unflattering about her management of the household, and the neighbourhood noticed these things and remembered them. So part of the morning routine, running parallel to and sometimes interrupting the personal beauty routine, was the preparation of the children for whatever the day required. Hair was combed, and in the case of girls often braided or put in ribbons, because a girl with a neat braid and a clean ribbon was a daughter who was being properly raised, and this was visible to anyone who saw her. The management of a boy's hair in the 1950s required water and a comb, and a particular product called Brill cream, or its equivalent, a cream or pomade that was worked through the hair and then combed into the correct style, which for boys was a side part with the hair lying flat and cooperative on both sides, or a neatly swept back style depending on the age and the occasion. Boys resisted the comb. This was understood. Ye held them by the shoulder and combed anyway, and then you checked the part was straight and the front was not doing anything independent, and you sent them downstairs, and by the time they reached the bottom step something had happened to the front section that could not be explained by physics alone. Girls' hair was a more extended project, particularly if the hair was long. Long hair in the 1950s was braided for school, because braids stayed in place through an entire school day in a way that other styles did not, and a girl who arrived home from school with her hair still neat was a minor triumph of the morning's effort. The braiding began with brushing, thorough and systematic, from the nape upward on each side, and if the child in question had tangles, which children reliably did, the brushing required patience on both sides of the process. A ribbon was tied at the end of each braid, in a colour that coordinated with the dress, because even at age 7 the coordination principle applied, and a red ribbon with a green dress was the kind of thing that a child did not control but a mother was responsible for. For church and school photographs and birthday parties, the standards elevated further and the time required expanded accordingly. Ringlets were produced with rag curlers or pin curls done the night before and released carefully in the morning to produce the bouncy, structured curls that the era considered the apex of little girl hair. The girl sat still while her mother worked, or did not sit still, and was asked firmly to try again, and the curls were coaxed into their arrangement and sprayed lightly with something that would hold them through the event without making them feel like sculpture. All of this was accomplished before school started, before anyone had eaten breakfast in some cases, woven into the same morning that required your own pin curls to come out and your own foundation to go on, and the girdle to be negotiated and the seams on the stockings to be checked. The children's appearance was an extension of your competence as a mother, which was itself an extension of your competence as a woman, which the 1950s considered a coherent and continuous thing. The inside of the house and the outside of the children, and the surface of yourself, all part of the same presentation that you maintained, or you didn't. And the neighbourhood was always, quietly and without malice, keeping score. And at the end of it all, after the evening routine was finished and the cold cream was back in its jar and the pin curls were in, and the house was quiet, there was a moment at the vanity mirror that no magazine article described and no advertisement addressed, which was the moment when a woman looked at herself in the glass without any of it on. No foundation, no lipstick, no carefully shaped brows. Just her face, slightly shiny from the night cream, looking back at her in the lamplight. What she thought in that moment is not recorded anywhere. The women of the 1950s were not, as a general rule, encouraged toward the kind of self-examination that involved questioning whether all of this was necessary. The face in the mirror at the end of the day was the unedited version, the face that existed before the morning's work and would exist after the morning's work was removed again each night, permanent beneath the daily layer of presentation in a way that the presentation never quite was. It had lines that the foundation smoothed over, colour that the rouge replaced or supplemented, brows that the pencil redrew in a more approved shape. It was a face that had been managed through the day, maintained at the correct standard through touch-ups and powder room visits and strategic application of lacquer and lipstick, and now the management was over, and the face was simply what it was. Some women looked at this face with something like relief. The private version always a little easier than the public one, in the way that taking your shoes off at the end of the day is easier regardless of how comfortable the shoes were. Others looked at it with a complicated feeling that had no clean name, something between satisfaction at having done the day correctly and a quiet acknowledgement that doing the day correctly had cost something that was not fully accounted for in the ledger of the household budget or the beauty routine's published time estimate. The magazines did not address this feeling because the magazines were not in the business of naming it. They were in the business of telling you which cold cream to use next, which was a different kind of help entirely. What the mirror showed, if you looked at it honestly, was evidence of a life organised around an external standard, maintained from the first pin curl to the last blotted tissue, a life in which the distance between how you looked and how you were supposed to look was a gap you closed every morning and reopened every night with cold cream and patience. Whether this was a burden or a pleasure or something in the complicated middle ground that most of life actually occupies depended on the woman and the day and the particular hour of the evening, and whether the children had been difficult, and whether the hair had cooperated, and whether any part of the day had offered something that felt like it was genuinely for her rather than for the presentation of her. The 1950s housewife did not complain about the beauty routine, at least not in the documented record, not in the magazines, not in the public conversation. What she thought privately at the vanity mirror in the lamplight before she turned off the lamp and went to bed is something we can only imagine, which means we imagine it through the lens of our own time, and perhaps we're not the most objective observers. What we can say with certainty is that she got up the next morning and she did it all again, and she did it well, and she did it without being thanked for it, and she was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The cold cream went on in slow upward circles. The pin curls went in, the lamp went out. Tomorrow was already waiting, and she was already in the dark and the quiet getting ready for it. So tonight, as you lie in your clean bed with your face unpinned and your hair unwashed and your girdle absolutely nowhere in the vicinity, take a quiet moment to think about the women who did all of this every single day, without being asked if they wanted to, without being thanked when they did it well, without a single magazine article that said, by the way, you are enough, exactly as you are, which is a sentence that would not have made much sense in 1952 and would not have sold any cold cream regardless. These women woke before their families and worked on themselves in the lamplight of the vanity, pin by pin, stroke by stroke, building the version of themselves that the decade required. They managed households and children and stockings with wandering seams and girdles, with opinions and hair that had thoughts about humidity that differed significantly from their own. They did it with skill and consistency and a quiet competence that the era accepted as baseline and never once elevated to remarkable, which it absolutely was. They were not victims of the routine. Most of them would have pushed back firmly on that characterization. They found genuine pleasure in the ritual, in the craft of a well-applied lip, in the satisfaction of a set that held through a full day, in the particular pride of a household and a self that both looked exactly as they should. There is real dignity in doing something well, and these women did many things extraordinarily well, and they knew it even when no one else said so. But they also lived inside a set of expectations so total and so continuous that the idea of a morning without the routine, a Tuesday without the foundation and the girdle and the mascara and the coordinated accessories was not really available to them as a choice. The standard was the air. You breathed it, or you didn't breathe, and most women breathed it and made it their own, and found a life inside it that was genuine and full and theirs. What they left behind is not just a set of beauty rituals catalogued in old magazines. It is evidence of a kind of endurance that deserves more than nostalgia. They held things together with cold cream and bobby pins, and a level of daily effort that modern life, for all its complications, does not require in quite the same way. They were resourceful and precise and patient, and the world they maintained so carefully made space for the next generation to ask questions that the 1950s did not have room for yet. So tonight, if you skipped your skincare, or your hair is doing something independent and you've decided not to address it until morning, you're living in the long exhale of everything they held in. The beauty standards have changed. The girdle is largely retired. The seam is no longer required to run straight up the back of your leg before you're allowed to go to the grocery store. You've been given the gift of a Tuesday that belongs to you. That gift was not free. It was paid for in pin curls and powder rooms and 520 hours a year of a routine that reset itself every morning without complaint, in the quiet lamplight, at the vanity, by women who deserved far more credit than the cold cream jar ever gave them. Sleep well. They earned your rest.